prosecution. So my prosecution was an experiment to see whether some law, in this case, the Espionage Act, so-called Espionage Act, could be used against the non-espionage defendant. I wasn't claimed to be a spy. It was recognized that I was a source. In fact, they were acting out of patriotic motives to give information to the public that the government did not want out. Violations of treaties, revealed decades of lying to the American public and of secret threats that had increasingly escalated a wrongful, hopeless, murderous war. Like, for example, the war that we have waged on Iraq for many years now. I don't think any of those wars would have come about had there been whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning or Ed Snowden, both of whom were facilitated by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. If the public and the Congress had been told about the planning, the threats, the lies involved in those operations, I think that what amount to millions of people ultimately would have lived, would have had their lives spared. The point here is that for many years, whistleblowers have been essentially needed if we were to avert both unconstitutional and terrible, wrongful wars. Julian Assange set up WikiLeaks in order to facilitate whistleblowers, to facilitate, publish, really, information that governments were wrongly withholding from their public, and it was needed by the public, and he did so. I actually stood at his side in a press conference in 2010 when he revealed the so-called Iraq war logs. Thousands of pages we know now were supplied by Chelsea Manning, but many illegalities, including torture. So a number of governments, Britain, which was a very cooperative partner in this coalition of the willing in aggression against Iraq, it revealed crimes, actually. Not only in the, it wasn't high enough level in the decision-making to reveal how we got into Iraq, but what we were doing when we were there, which involved death squads, assassinations, and torture, widespread torture, was something that our government did not want known. It was a clear revelation of war crimes. And so it was kept classified.
Draw a parallel between your experience as a whistleblower, the New York Times as a publisher, and today with WikiLeaks.
Thanks to a memoir by Jim Goodale, the then counsel of the New York Times during the Pentagon Papers adjudication, the attempt to censor the press, actually the first time that there was an effort actually to, that prior restraint that would have an injunction against the publication of anything, but in this case, the Pentagon Papers. He revealed that he had known at that time that Nixon, President Nixon, had impaneled a grand jury that was pursuing the prosecution of New York Times journalists like Neil Sheehan and Hedrick Smith. That was very little known up until quite recently. And apparently their lawyer at that time had told Goodale that he fully expected them to be indicted. That would have been the first indictment of a journalist. Now, almost half a century later, Julian Assange is now the first to have actually been indicted as a journalist on this case. And that will mean essentially that we won't have a free press. The public will know essentially what the government chooses to tell them, however untrue and however selective and misleading about its own operations. It's hard to call that a democratic republic. And that's where we're on the verge of achieving right now. The Espionage Act has been an abuse of law continuously since my prosecution, been used against a number of other people, in particular by President Obama, and now by President Trump as many times as in 2 years, 3 years, as Obama in 8 years. This new case it would be hard even for this Supreme Court, I think, to see it as other than a violation of the First Amendment. And yet the prosecution itself, even if it fails, is meant to be and probably would be an effective deterrent to investigative reporting. in the national security field. So much depends then on preventing or stopping this extradition or prosecution or conviction of Julian Assange.
Well then, thank you very much for that. And it's always great to see Dan Ellsberg, as I said before, is one of our national chairs. The title, as I said, of today's webinar is Freedom of the Press, Julian Assange, and the New York Times Problem Explained. And I want to be clear, that title wasn't chosen because the New York Times is causing problems for Julian Assange. Rather, it refers to the fact that when the Obama administration was considering whether to indict Assange for publishing leaks of classified information, when the New York Times and other mainstream publications publish such information all the time, that's a problem. And today, the problem also includes the question, will the New York Times and such publications still be afforded protection under the First Amendment, while WikiLeaks and other alternative media that publish such information online instead still be indicted? That's the New York Times problem that the government has. Now, Julian Assange is being prosecuted by the United States, as Dan said, under the old Espionage Act passed during World War I for use against spies. And he is the first journalist, as opposed to whistleblower, charged under that act. He's charged with conspiring to publish thousands of Iraq war logs, which he did, which among tens of thousands of documents exposed the lies and the criminal acts of the United States in the Iraq war. And if convicted, Assange faces up to 175 years in a US prison. In prosecuting Assange for espionage, the Trump administration dug very deep and came up with a buried subsection of the Espionage Act to prosecute anyone who simply receives, retains, or possesses national defense information, no matter how it may have come into their possession. Matt Taibbi, writing in the anthology entitled In Defense of Julian Assange, makes the point that if the government can get away with using the Espionage Act to successfully prosecute reporters and publishers, in very short order, we're going to have no publishers and no reporters who will dare to expose the truth on such matters to the American people as Julian Assange did. Nils Melzer, the UN's special rapporteur on torture and other cruel and inhumane, degrading treatment, has said of Julian Assange that ever since WikiLeaks started publishing evidence of US war crimes, and here I quote, there has been a relentless and unrestrained campaign of public mobbing, intimidation, and defamation against Mr. Assange. In 20 years of work with victims of war, violence, and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law, close quote. Julian Assange is currently locked away in a notorious London prison, awaiting the outcome of the US government's request that Assange be extradited back to the United States to stand trial. And so it should greatly alarm all who cherish a free press in America that so far, the Biden administration and its Justice Department under Merrick Garland has continued to prosecute the case against Julian Assange. It is doing so by continuing the appeal of a decision in the extradition case in London that was actually favorable to Assange. Yes, the court ruled that because of Julian Assange situation, he should not be extradited back to the US. After all, the court reasoned, given Assange's tortured mental state after so many years of persecution, and given that his confinement under US prison conditions would constitute further torture and actually endanger Assange's life, he should not be extradited. Now, I want to mention that the defense in the Assange case mentioned a great number of other, and frankly, more important from the free speech and free publication angle, defenses as to why Assange should not be sent back to this country under this extradition order. The court took actually the least important politically, if you will, and the most personal to Assange reason for not granting the indictment. And while we are grateful for that ruling, we are very sorry that the much more important rulings were not rendered by the judge. The United States government, as I say, is nevertheless appealing even that one ruling. And if they are successful, only then will Assange's defense team have an opportunity to present some of those other defenses that the lower court saw fit not to rule on. Julian himself, writing to the world from his horrific coronavirus-filled prison cell, he tells us, and I quote here, "I am unbroken, but the days when I could read and speak and organize to defend myself, my ideals and my people are over until I am free. Everyone else must take my place," he says. "I am defenseless and counting on you and others of good character to save my life. Truth ultimately is all we have." And so the question that confronts us today is this: after decades of ever greater repression of the press, are we going to let Julian Assange's case become a final nail in the coffin of a free and independent press in America? Or will the almost unimaginable injustice of his case arouse our justifiable anger and inspire us to fight like hell to save Julian's life as we fight like hell to save freedom of the press? We already find ourselves living in a United States of dangerously diminished democracy. And without a free and truth-telling press, we will never win back our lost democracy. For Julian Assange is right. The truth ultimately is all that matters. And now let me formally introduce our panelists one by one. Our first panelist is George Freeman. George Freeman is the executive director of the Media Law Resource Center. He is a former assistant general counsel of the New York Times Company, where he was at the forefront of numerous high-profile cases for that company. George is a well-known speaker on media and First Amendment issues. He is the William J. Brennan Visiting Professor at the Columbia Journalism School and also teaches at New York University and CUNY's Graduate School of Journalism. He has led or participated in many media groups and is the founder and co-chair of the American Bar Association's Forum on Communications Law, their annual conference. George Freeman, it's a pleasure, and we thank you for being with us. Please. No, I cannot.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah,
there we go.
The easiest way to begin, I think, really, is to just say a few words about Dan Ellsberg, who we saw looking very young and sprightly just a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Because really, I mean, the granddaddy of them all in this instance is the Pentagon Papers, which happened to have been just exactly 50 years ago. In fact, I think it was 50 years and maybe 3 or 4 weeks that he met with Neil Sheehan and essentially transmitted the Pentagon Papers to Sheehan, who was a Times reporter. And in a 3 or 4 month period, while the Times went through all those documents with painstaking care before they were published in June of 1971. And the decision by the court, I believe, was the first day of July. So this is all exactly 50 years ago this spring that this took place. But Dan really acted with incredible courage and morality in basically knowing that his freedom would be taken from him and that he would be really sentenced to, I think it was ultimately 117 years in prison if he were convicted, and he understood that the odds were overwhelming that he would be convicted. But yet he did that because he really felt a moral obligation to stop the Vietnam War and to save the lives of Vietnamese and Americans both in that quagmire 15,000 miles away. Fortunately for him, the Nixon administration overplayed its hand as a forerunner of Watergate, and the case against him, where he really was kind of a dead duck, was thrown out for prosecutorial misconduct. The main element of which was the Nixon plumbers sneaking their way into his psychiatrist's office to get dirt on him, something that really wasn't terribly necessary for the case. And secondly, which is less known but still true, there were two discussions between Nixon top aides and the trial judge, inquiring whether the trial judge might be interested in the job of director of the FBI after J. Edgar Hoover either retired or died. And for the conglomerate of those reasons, the judge threw the case out. And Ellsberg told me that it was the happiest day of his life because he otherwise knew that he was in big, big peril. So just a shout out to him, because that's really how we got started down this road, obviously. In discussing the Assange case, I think it's really important to look at it in two different ways, because it really creates two different claims, two different issues. One is, and this is what the original indictment was about, was he in bed with Chelsea Manning in terms of hacking, in terms of getting government materials out of the government, which is a crime. And to the extent, whether he's a journalist or not, and there's no real definition of what's a journalist, so that's an unanswerable question, and the law doesn't require an answer to it. But for a journalist generally is not going to be involved in the hacking, in the stealing, in illegal activity to get the documents out of the government. And so the question that really the grand jury, I think, in the Obama administration took 3 years looking at was whether they could find evidence of that, of Assange's really doing illegal acts along with Manning to pry the documents out of the government. If all Assange did was just passively receive them, then under the precedents that we all know, there is no crime committed. He didn't do anything illegal, and using the espionage against him would be totally unprecedented. And we'll get to that in a second. But the first question is really, did he do anything illegal? And the problem is that there's not a very good definition of what is illegal. The Supreme Court case that discussed this the most is called Bartnicki, and it says you can't that you can't be punished if you publish something that's truthful, which this certainly was, that's newsworthy, which this certainly was, and you didn't do anything illegal to obtain it. And so the question is, passive reception, it just appears on your desk, that's fine. You're going in yourself, and kind of scrubbing it from government files or government computers is not fine. But there's a huge gray area in between. Hey, I wonder, do you have any documents that might be helpful to me on such and such a topic that I'm reporting on? Well, yes. Well, geez, that's interesting. What do you got? Well, I can probably get you this, that, and the other. Oh, that'd be really interesting. Why don't you do that? The government might say that's already aiding and abetting in part of the illegal activity. And that's in fact what they say in this indictment. Journalists would say that's what we do every day, and national security journalism couldn't exist if you can't at least have that very rudimentary conversation that I just outlined. So those are the issues, the first issues, and those are the issues that were in the original indictment. Then came a superseding indictment that included 3 more paragraphs that basically didn't make claims along those lines, but said something really far starker and more unprecedented. And that is that just publishing alone, even if you didn't do anything at all to help obtain the documents, but publishing alone would be enough, particularly if those documents ended up causing harm. Now, there's no evidence that harm was caused, and it's interesting that 10 years later, the government really hasn't ever said what any lives lost or any damage caused because of these leaks. But still, in that last indictment, they say that lives were endangered, and that therefore, and by the way, the Espionage Act doesn't really differentiate whether you've in fact endangered lives or not. It's whether you've harmed national security or not. But that's what's scary, and why I think Jim has named this the New York Times problem, Because presumably, at least if the lawyers who followed me at the Times, as I'm sure they did, would advise their reporters not to get involved in the actual scheming to get documents out of the government, but certainly we receive them and publish them. And if you can be indicted and prosecuted for publishing, that really brings up all of the chilling and the deterrent effects that Dan Ellsberg was talking about. And that would be totally unprecedented in a very, very grave sense. So you have to look, I think, at those two problems separately. Now, looking at Julian Assange, he's really not a very sympathetic character, whether it's because of all the documents he's released. People don't like him. Democrats don't like him for other reasons that really are totally irrelevant to this discussion, I think. He has the problem in Sweden and what his relationships there were. So my guess, or my strong feeling, is that the Obama administration really wanted to only make claims having to do with the first issue. That is to say, whether he was in bed with Chelsea Manning in getting the documents out of the government. And since they didn't find that evidence, they really didn't go ahead. Ultimately, I think Donald Trump thought that he was an unsympathetic character. Perhaps good law could be made with even these unprecedented claims of publication. So why don't we try that? Because if we can succeed against an unsympathetic criminal defendant and get good precedent, then boy, we're going to scare the bejesus out of the mainstream media and have a precedent that really would help us going forward if we wanted to bring the same case against the Washington Post or the New York Times. If you think that the folks in the Trump administration thought this through, which maybe is giving them more credit than due, it's entirely possible that that was their thinking, and that's why this indictment has become as broad as it has. So that's kind of the legal setup, I think, that you have to look at. And on that score, there really is no precedent for guilt for just publication of national security sensitive documents if you had nothing to do with the obtaining them. And that's because the legislative history of the Espionage Act appears to be aimed at spies, not against mainstream media who are just carrying this information and giving it to the public. B, there's an intent requirement to harm the United States. And if that has to be proven, certainly the intent of the mainstream media, I can't speak to what Assange's intent was, but certainly the intent of the mainstream media in these cases is to inform the public, not to harm the United States. And thirdly, and in my view, most importantly, is this Bartnicki case that says that if you just published material which you acquired without doing anything illegal, then the Constitution appears to bar any sort of prosecution for your of guilt for your publishing it, except that there's a ringer as part of that three-part test. It has to be newsworthy, has to be truthful, no problems there. You can't have done anything illegal, no problem there if you just look at the publishing prong. But then it says, absent the government interest of the highest order. And we don't really know what that means because that's never been interpreted, because in the cases such as the Bartnicki case, you're dealing with one person's phone tapping or naming of a rape victim or naming of a juvenile delinquent. And those sort of things really are not government interests of the highest order. But one could certainly see a Supreme Court or any court that's loaded with conservative or Trump type appointees finding that this does come under that exception. And that really would be the jeopardy here of how a case like this could be lost. I think justices who would be more First Amendment friendly would somehow not view this as meeting that exception. But that's actually where this case would go if, unfortunately, it ever reached a high level in the United States many years down the road. So that's the kind of the legal setup that I would frame for the discussion we're going to have tonight. The other thing I would mention, though, is that we've lived with this Espionage Act for over 100 years now. And really, it's somehow, amazingly enough, as badly written as it is, and as rarely until the last few years as it's been used, it really has worked pretty well. There's a kind of a balance between the government and the press that's worked, and everyone respects the possibility that something bad might happen to them if they use the Espionage Act. And therefore, they kind of behave all right in their respective corners. And therefore, this balance has existed. But part of what creates the balance, I think, is that the press is thought to and does act responsibly. That the press, as they did with the unloading by Assange to the New York Times, the Guardian, the Spiegel, of the Iraq and Afghanistan logs and the State Department cables and the like, went through those documents with a fine tooth and comb to make sure that they would redact any information in there that could be injurious to the national defense or even to individuals who would be jeopardized in foreign countries. And that's an important element of this whole thing, that the press has to act responsibly on its own because it doesn't want to harm national security. And so one of the questions that's raised, I think, by these cases is whether in the age of the internet, where you can have most anyone putting information that might be injurious to the country online, does that balance work anymore? And I think that's what really, in the end, this case is all about. It's about the internet age, and does the old balance that has worked work today? And the sad truth is, I think to some degree, and it may be that I'm wrong on the facts, is that Assange at one point got so upset with the Times for not treating him as more of a hero, giving him more credit for being their source, reporting a lot on his the sexual claims against him, ended up not going to the Times anymore after that first document dump of the documents I've just talked about. But he then put stuff on his WikiLeaks blog or website himself without really going through the painstaking editing that we've just been talking about. And that, at least hypothetically, could cause more damage or danger than what the Times did. And that's why there's a little bit of a distinction and a little bit of a new problem caused by this whole situation where, you know, you can't be that sure that the distributor of this information will act as responsibly as the mainstream media has in the past. So I think I'd stop there, Jim, unless there's anything I should continue with. But that's really, I think, an outline of the situation in broad strokes, and that's kind of where I'm coming from in terms of this discussion.
No, thank you, George. And you'll get a chance when we get into the discussion back and forth to answer some other questions and to expand on what you've said if you care to. I thank you very much, George, really. We now have our other panelist, Erin Aubry Kaplan, who I mentioned before, I think is a contributing writer to the New York Times opinion page. In fact, I just read a terrific piece of hers about January 6th, a few days ago or a week ago. Time goes so crazy now. A piece which I very much agreed with, and encourage you to go back and check if you missed it. Explaining why she's still very angry and why I think we ought to all still be very angry. She's also was a former weekly op-ed columnist for the LA Times. Her articles have appeared, well, in many publications, including Ms. Magazine, UCLA Magazine, The Guardian, The London Independent, Salon.com, The Crisis, Newsday, The Utne Reader, and Black Enterprise. She is the author of Black Talk, Blue Thoughts, and Walking the Color Line, Dispatches from a Black Journalista. That was in 2011, and I Heart Obama in 2016. Erin Aubry Kaplan.
Thank you, Jim, for that introduction. And thank you for reading that last column of mine. I think I took great umbrage because January 6th is my birthday, and it will never be. It will as a day that will live in historical infamy from now on. Well, this is such an interesting discussion, and thank you, George, for that really a comprehensive legal framework. I am not, I'm honored to be here. I am not, it's funny, I was thinking, am I a journalist? Now I'm not sure. But it's, there are many things I could say, but I'm not a national security writer, but this whole thing affects journalists and journalism. And I just have to say, I remember the Pentagon Papers. I was a kid back in '71, but even at that point, I assumed that the U.S. press, the American press, would just kind of get bolder and sort of, that would be sort of a starting point for or a continuation point for the growth of the watchdog press. Actually, what's happened since then to me has been the opposite. The American press has not been that. That balance that George is talking about between the press and government, I think, has not been balanced quite a long time. And so Julian Assange is a really interesting problem. And I think that partly because he's not, like you say, is quite a sympathetic character. We're not quite sure if he's an honest broker all the time. But I think that, and there is a difference between, someone I read was talking about the difference between what a journalist does and what Julian Assange does. Journalists and editors curate information. What Julian Assange has done on his own is sort of just turn all the lights on, as somebody put it, turn all the lights on. Whereas a journalist will sort of, will turn on this light or that light or give certain things context. But I think, though, in the context of today, where we don't have enough information, we have had wars, as George pointed out, as Daniel Ellsberg pointed out, rooted in lies. And here's what disturbs me. This is a bigger issue that kind of is beyond Julian Assange, but I think he's trying to correct the problem, is that the American public, maybe the global public, we are beginning to see, we see these lies. We see what's going on behind the curtain. Even before we had WikiLeaks, we all knew the Iraq War was a lie. We all that was evident then, and yet the public, the public actually protested. We had the biggest protest, as I remember, in American history, in the run up to the Iraq War, and yet it happened. So I think that the bigger problem is the break between public sentiment and governance. That's been true a long time. And I think, with the advent of the internet and with so many things being online, I just wonder about our ability to, our capacity for outrage and our ability to direct the outrage at the right party. And I wonder about what journalists think of Julian Assange. I don't hear a lot of discussion about the case amongst, I have a very limited circle, but I really wonder how journalists feel about this. Journalists who are scrambling for jobs still because of our economic collapse and other things. But it is an amazing act of courage to kind of sacrifice your life, no matter what your personality is. I think of Edward Snowden as well, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden. That kind of sacrifice, that kind of feeling is it's important enough to put the information out there, no matter what the consequences. I think that's a remarkable thing that I don't see too much of in our times. And there is this question about whether Julian Assange collaborated with Chelsea Manning, but I think that just the public's right to know is been abridged so much that I do see Julian Assange as heroic, if not exactly a hero. So I don't have too much to add, because really George did such a thorough job of kind of presenting all the situation. But there's something very tragic about it to me. I had this kind of, maybe it's a wild, optimistic hope that the Biden administration will somehow dial this back, will somehow find a way to dismiss it or minimize it or just not go ahead with prosecuting Julian Assange. Because like you say, the interesting thing to me is that we really don't have a definition of what a journalist is. And that hasn't been addressed much at all, unless I'm wrong, unless there's something I'm missing here. Something that kind of surprised me in researching this topic, that we don't really have a definition of the press, even though the press is protected in the Constitution, right? And that's really changed because of, change. And the definition of journalism, the definition that we never had has been further muddied by the fact that anyone, sort of sitting in a bathrobe in front of a computer can be a journalist. I'm not being funny. So, all these things are questions that really are big questions that we really need to answer going forward. Because I think, this is the first time, I guess 2010 would be the first time since 71 that this whole issue of the press putting out this kind of information came up again. So far the New York Times and has not been indicted, and I'm assuming won't be. But I wonder about the press's, whatever the press is, their appetite for these kinds of stories and this kind of revelation. My experience in the last 30 years is that there hasn't been a whole lot of appetite for it. Whenever you have things, you have embedded journalists, things like that, it makes you really wonder about the press's role as watchdog, let alone kind of keeping all the lights on,
Thank you. Oh, thank you. No, thank you very much. I do appreciate that. Let me, before I ask some questions of Erin and of George, let me just make a couple of brief comments of my own, just because, somebody's been to law school, you can't shut up when you George understands that, but he told me a funny story about that the other day. But here's what I do want to say. I must say, I do find Julian Assange to be heroic. It's been almost 11 years now since his indictment. He knew full well when he undertook this what probably lay ahead. He knew full well, especially at that time, that online journalists, reporters, whatever, weren't going to enjoy the kind of privilege and protection, perhaps, and respect that print journalists do. Indeed, the print media has not been happy in all cases, certainly not initially with the growth of online news reporting and journalism, what have you. So there was that. Secondly, just on a point George made, it is certainly a popular conception, although frankly not accurate, and in some important ways very inaccurate. George mentioned, for example, Sweden. He may not be the most ideal character. There's in the book that I mentioned before, the anthology in defense of Julian Assange, some reporters take about 24 or 5 rumors and charges that have been leveled against Assange. Almost everything that he's not a baby killer, I guess, was somehow left out of the mix, but pretty much everything else has been in there. And one of them, of course, being that these rape charges. Interesting thing is, and of course, this has not been reported in the press much at all, but it is a fact that the 2 women who were supposedly the subjects of these rapes had said themselves publicly that they were not raped, that the Swedish government is lying about what they said in the first place, and that all of those charges and rumors were because they believe because the US government and the Western powers wanted to get Assange for what he did in dumping all of this embarrassing information out into the world. And then, he didn't cause Hillary Clinton to lose the election. She did that all on her own, quite well by not going to Wisconsin and Michigan, and we can name some other things. But part of what the US government has helped orchestrate, it is my point, a panoply of false charges in order to discredit what Assange did and to discredit the very truth of the documents that he laid out there for us all to see. even if they were not gone through in the way some journalists might have traditionally gone through. Well, that said, I want to say that the first question I want to put to, especially to George, but Erin, pipe in on anything. I have some questions for you as well.
Okay.
And in this regard, Jim Capizzo, who is one of our listeners, put this into the box. I'm feeling I should probably step aside and let Jim take over moderating, because it's the first question I have right here that I planned on asking, almost word for word. And the question is, George, what about state sovereignty? That is, what right does the United States have to prosecute a foreign national like Assange, who's never stepped foot in the United States soil, nor did his alleged crime take place here? So isn't that an issue? I mean, I realize the U.S. thinks of itself as has the right to be the policeman of the world, but what about this sovereignty question?
I mean, I think there are a number of questions. One is that, and I don't have a great answer other than I think that would be a pretty strong defense point. But I guess I'm not an expert in criminal law enough to let you know what the government's answer to that would be. But I find the more intriguing question along similar lines is that the Espionage Act says that the act has to cause damage to foreign nations. And in fact, the leaks here are not causing harm hypothetically to foreign nations, but to terrorist groups that aren't nations by any definition. So one wonders how the arguments can be made that this even comes under the Espionage Act simply because the groups at issue aren't nations. Al-Qaeda or the Taliban are not nations, and therefore one could argue that on the very words of the Espionage Act, they don't really apply.
Yeah, no, that's another good point. Erin Kaplan, Julian Assange and Daniel Ellsberg argue, we just heard them make the point tonight, and I've heard Assange make it many times, that if we had true freedom of the press in America, then the lies that led to the Vietnam War or the Iraq War and other wars, Gulf of Tonkin, or, they have weapons of mass destruction and so forth, would have been known to the American people if we had the kind of vigorous and free press that I think Assange demonstrates. Those things would have been known to the American people. And the US government would have been far less likely to have entered into the wars had those lies been known in the first place. And there certainly would have been more opposition to the beginning. That is, that if the American people know the truth about the lies often told by our government when it seeks to enter into war, there'd be fewer wars. Erin Kaplan, you think that's true?
I'd like to think that's true. I was just thinking as you were talking, what happens these days is people in government know the truth. They don't reveal it in real time. So what happens is they do a book deal later, and then it all comes out, and it's all too late. That seems to be the way things work. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that I'm not sure that the press was kept from information, or they didn't press hard enough, say in the 50s and the 60s, before the Vietnam War was starting. I think there was this sort of agreement between the press, a lot of times between the press and the government, that the press would just put out certain things, that they wouldn't embarrass the government. They wouldn't oppose the government publicly. I'm not saying that, I wonder about that because it was a different era. And I think about FDR. I think about how the press kind of made sure to put out images of him not as a disabled man, but as like standing up. Like that's almost not like celebrity press, but almost. And I for me, like I said, I thought that all sort of changed dramatically in the early 70s before Watergate, with the Pentagon Papers. And the press suddenly found its voice or found its role as the watchdog of government. I'm not sure that existed, or that was really a part of American culture before then. And you could take issue with me, but it seemed to me that there was this understanding, and I'm sure there are individual journalists who did not feel that way. But for the most part, the press has had been pretty cozy with government, correct? And that culture didn't it took a while to change, and I would argue it's still not, it's not completely changed, particularly now in the era where journalism is no longer privately, well, it was privately funded. Now it's sort of, because the revenue model is broken apart, and you have nonprofit news organizations, which are different and more obviously reliant on foundation money, et cetera. That's part of the problem too. But principally, I think that the relationship that the press has always had to government is really key. And I don't know if the press has just actively decided not to put out certain information, or to look the other way, or to just sort of be the sort of silent booster of the U.S. government.
Let me speak to that for a second.
History.
Please, George, I think, Erin, hold on, I think you got
but
interrupted.
I wonder if that's the problem.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Hold on just 1 second, because you're kind of like you'll come back in a second. Go ahead, George.
I was just gonna say, Erin's really totally right. I mean, the whole relationship between government and the press changed in the early 70s because of A, Vietnam, and B, Watergate. I mean, that's clearly true. And in fact, apparently in Vietnam, I mean, there was something called the 5 o'clock follies, which is when the top brass gave press conferences to the press, and the press just laughed because they had been out in the field. They saw how terrible that everything was. And then they came back to Saigon, and in this press conference at 5 o'clock every afternoon, a rosy picture was painted, and they thought it was a joke. This is why the press conference was called the 5 o'clock follies. So that really started the lying and the understanding that they were being lied to, all exacerbated by what happened in Watergate. When I was at the Times, and I was there for 30 years, from 1981 to 2012, basically I wouldn't say the rule, but the guideline is that we publish anything, even if it embarrasses the government, even if it's awkward for the government, which I think the Assange disclosures were. But that's not a question. As to stuff that really could harm the national defense or national security, what the Times at least demanded was an explanation from high-ranking people in the government, not middle-level managers who are trying to cover their ass, but really the top people, explaining to the Times exactly what the jeopardy was, specifically, not with general, cliches, but really specifically going through that. And if they could make a case, then we would delay the story, or maybe redact a couple of facts that the government was most concerned with, if we really thought that, yes, it was a danger to national security. I mean, I think there's no question that any reasonable newspaper would not publish the date and the place where the troop ships were landing on enemy soil, because then you're just kind of, D-Day wouldn't exist. I mean, that's a great question. Could D-Day have happened today? God knows. But it's fascinating that it did happen without any knowledge by the enemy whatsoever. I mean, it's really a miracle if you think about it. I was involved in one. I mean, you said someone said that there hadn't been anything before 2010, before this. And actually, I was involved when the Times wrote stories about the unconstitutional warrantless wiretapping of the Bush administration as part of the war on terrorists, where they were wiretapping American phone calls to kind of see if the terrorists were on the other line and what was being transmitted. And that there were processes that were supposed to be gone through, which the Bush administration didn't go through. And Times reporters got wind of this. And as they worked on the story, the government, rather than really deny it anymore, basically just started pleading with the Times not to publish that. And that led to a meeting at the White House between Bush and the publisher and executive editor of the Times. The meeting didn't start well because the publisher of the Times, Arthur Sulzberger, whose family had owned the Times since 1896, started with a joke, turned to George W. Bush and said, "You and me got our jobs the same way," i.e. through our fathers. And apparently President Bush didn't really like that bit of humor. And so the meeting got off to a rocky start. But then within moments, Bush basically turned to the editor and said, if you run this story and there's a terrorist attack, you will have the blood of Americans on your hands because it will have been your fault. And that's pretty daunting language. Nonetheless, I mean, I reviewed the story. I suggested some changes. The espionage law is a little more strict when it deals with telecommunications, and this is kind of phone wiretapping. That's a telecommunication. So, but generally, the story was run, and the assumption at the Times was, based on the Pentagon Papers case, that we'd always run this story. So there was no holding back, and that's not the philosophy, I don't think, to hold back at all. The story was run, and 2 days later, basically Bush, Cheney, and I think Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, all got on TV on the Sunday morning shows and said the Times is going to be prosecuted, the publisher is going to be in jail. And I didn't really believe any of it because it didn't make any sense. It was so unprecedented. Does Bush really want to be bringing a case where the unconstitutionality of his own government is going to be at play every day? PR-wise, it didn't seem to really be a good thing for them. What I was worried about, and really what half of the problem that we're talking about that hasn't come up so far, is that they could easily have subpoenaed our reporters for who the leaks were that gave us this information.
Oh,
And
yeah.
on that, we would have been in very, very bad shape because Judy Miller had just gone to jail for exactly the same issue and refused to talk about her sources. And therefore, she went to jail for 85 days. And this was a year later, frankly. And so that's what I was worried about for years, that they were going to subpoena us and our reporters would slowly be off to jail. As it turned out, for reasons never clear, it didn't happen, but it very well could have. So that's another jeopardy in this whole thing.
Well, and speaking of jeopardies, we have another question I'm getting from the chat box. This one from Sharon Kyle, and it's pretty much almost word for word in some ways what I wanted to ask. So I'll put the two questions together. If Assange, this is to both of you, if Assange were to ultimately get extradited back to the United States, and remember, we're urging everyone to write to Biden, write to the Attorney General, Justice Department, please drop your appeal of the Assange ruling, which keeps him from being extradited back to the United States. But if he were extradited back, stands trial, and can he avoid conviction, or if convicted, expect to have a reversal of his conviction at the Supreme Court based on, the Pentagon Papers notion of against prior restraint? And in that regard, to the extent that that is a danger, why hasn't the mainstream media in general been more vociferous in defending Assange, lest that situation come to pass? What do you think, Erin, George, whoever?
Erin, well, let me
Go ahead.
Erin, go ahead. Let's not be too polite. Jump in, Erin. Go ahead.
Go ahead, George.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Go ahead, George. Come on.
Come on. Go ahead.
First of all, it's really important to realize that a prior restraint case is a much more difficult case for the government to bring and win than a prosecution. And that's because, just for a sentence, it's because the First Amendment is all about abridging speech. And if you're punishing speech, you're not really directly abridging speech. So a prior restraint goes directly against the words of the First Amendment. A prosecution is something different. And the test for the government is still going to be pretty hard. Did you, under Barnicki at least, was it truthful public interest, and did we do anything illegal? Now, the question really is, what is this court going to do? And I can't say I have great feelings about this court as it's currently constituted. I'm more optimistic about the Biden-Garland administration, because both of them have said that they don't want to put the press in jail for doing what journalists do. And I think in this case, in the end, whether or not Assange is considered a journalist, in this case, he pretty much did what journalists do.
Yeah.
He got information. He didn't himself do anything that seemed to be clearly illegal. And so I think that if they live up to the word that, journalists should do what they do, somehow they'll see a way not to prosecute this case to the end. And Lord knows, you said, well, why did they then even appeal the extradition? And it may be that, the decision against came, I think, at the beginning of January, before the inauguration even. So it may be that the ball was just rolling in that direction already. But I would really think there's a decent chance that somehow along the way, they will get off this train and not really further this prosecution. I think there's a pretty good chance of that, and I'm hopeful that'll happen.
All right, if I can, Aaron, just in the interest of time and everything else, let me put the question to you a little bit differently so that it involves another element I'd like to hear from you on. I asked the question about, given the consequences of Assange ending up in jail at any point in this, ought to scare the bedickens, it would seem to me, out of serious journalists and major mainstream media who, to the extent they want to publish the truth. I mean, it's interesting that Manning first actually took those Iraq war logs to the New York Times and the Washington Post. They didn't publish them. They published about them then and contents of them once Assange had done it on WikiLeaks. And you've both talked about how the oppression of the press, the repression of the press, the kind of, and of course I would add to it the growing monopolization of the press, big corporate, control of the press. You would think the press, as I say, or journalists at least, would be more outraged about it. And then I want to just add a little fill-up for you, Aaron, because of your experience. Your father, I remember, was the, I guess, editor, founder, the guy that ran certainly the LA Sentinel, a black run paper read widely in the, especially in the minority community here in Los Angeles. All of this, what's happening with the press, the monopolization of it, the clamping down on people. There's been a lot of whistleblower charges that have been brought under the espionage in recent years again and so forth. It would seem to me that the mainstream journalists should be frightened about this, should be supporting Assange more than they have been, frankly, and that especially minority newspapers and outlets should be, and I've found precious little in the black press, frankly, in America. So your thoughts about that now, I admit, rather broad, open-ended question.
Yeah, sure. Wow, well, this is all complicated by the fact it's 2021. 11 years ago, it feels like many lifetimes ago. Mm-hmm. Things have been, first of all, I will say things have been really, first of all, I would say the press, in addition to being downsized and all that, it's been demonized. I mean, the press now, thanks to Trump and his 4 years of nonstop lying and demonization and gaslighting, the press has been demonized as, against the people, right? Sounds ridiculous to me and to all of us here, but the press has been relentlessly attacked, especially the New York Times, especially the Washington Post. And that just, it complicates the problem. At one point, I remember during Donald Trump's first campaign, didn't he say he loved WikiLeaks because he was he perceived WikiLeaks as being on the side of his campaign. Yes, and yeah, well, that's sort of an aside. But I think the mainstream press has, they've weathered this complete demonization, enemy of the people, the enemy of the people, might be why they're backing away from or just being sort of silent on the Assange case now. Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, I really think the press became more concerned over the years since the early 70s with access, right? Not so much holding the government, especially the military, to account. I just think that I don't think that's what they were doing. I think they were taking the 5 o'clock volleys seriously. They were, sort of repeating press releases and not, there's a guy I read, you might be aware of him, Andrew Bacevich. He's a, former Republican and military guy, but he has great criticism of how we've just all kind of been drawn into this very, very military culture. this very, since 9/11 too, very pro, pro anti-terrorism, et cetera. And the press has been, I think, scared away from holding the government accountable. And, you mentioned the warrantless wiretapping. That seems like not a minor offense in right now, but, the fact, it doesn't even, I'm not sure that would raise temperatures now. And then there's the general media landscape. I don't have to remind anyone, there is, not just Donald Trump, but a lot of what passes for press, Alex Jones and InfoWars and all that stuff, it's just spewing lies all the time. And what happens is what I think Hannah Arendt said, it's when there are lies out there all the time, it's not that people believe them so much, they just stop trying to believe anything, and so I think that includes the press, people, journalists, reporters, don't quite know what to be outraged about. It's hard to prioritize.
Well, I'm going to follow up with another question for you, Erin, in a minute, but I want to ask George a question, which I think is probably quickly answered. I don't happen to know the answer to it. It's asked by Steve Rohde in the chat box. And that is whether your organization, the Media Resource Center, has it taken a position yet in support of Assange? George?
We really don't take positions other than through amicus briefs. And I'm sure that if the case actually comes to the U.S., we would support him and clearly support the defense, both in terms of his freedom and in terms of the precedent for the press in the long run.
Mm-hmm. All right. And Erin, could you expand a little bit on what you see as this the problem of access and how the firing of so many reporters, some of that in the name of economy, but who knows? The firing of so many reporters affects the quality of what is now reported.
Oh, well, sure. It's like any business. I mean, we've had what I guess we call the work speed up. So certain journalists are laid off, not so much fired, I would say laid off. The remaining reporters take up the slack. So they're doing a lot of work. So no one, and you have, because of the layoffs and the fund and money, et cetera, you have journalists who could spend months doing a story, the investigative stuff that costs money,
Yeah.
so those go away, or those are greatly diminished. Foreign bureaus closed, things like that. All that has a great impact on the coverage of the reporters by the reporters who are left. It's such a horrible timing because so many issues are expanding. Climate change. We need exponentially more reporters doing deep work all the time, not fewer. And so I guess it's a little unfair to pile on reporters because a lot of them, are doing their work plus the work of many others. And, we just really have not figured out this funding model. I mean, for a long time, up until the 2000s, early 2000s, families or, owned papers, they more or less stayed out of the way of the media. Then suddenly, or not so suddenly, papers were not properties anybody wanted to own. And so here in the LA, the Chandler sold the LA Times. The LA Times went through all kinds of just downsizing and almost slumlord ownership. And this affected a lot of media. And so when that's happening, you're destabilized like that. It's very hard to keep up the quality of the product. So I think like teachers in this country, we demand a lot of journalists, but you got to give them the resources and the leeway. And I hope that comes back. It's very discouraging to see the old LA Times building downtown, which at one point was full.
Yep.
Then it became half full, and now it's in El Segundo. I'm nothing against El Segundo. I live close by there, but it's not quite the same thing. But I don't know what the answer to that question is about how to fund a profession that is mentioned in the Constitution. The private ownership is not that stable. The nonprofit ownership is too new to really, know if that's the best solution, but I think it's a real problem in terms of coverage that we need.
But that's a real benefit of an online outfit like WikiLeaks in doing what it does, how much it was able to do. Imelda Aguilera asked us a question. She's making the point really, and she suggests that don't we think, and I certainly do, that what the government has done to Assange is to send a warning really to others who might be so bold to do what he did, not to do so. And that leads me into the question I wanted to put to you, George, to start with. And that is, I gave a quote in my early introductory remarks from Matt Taibbi in the anthology in defense of Julian Assange it comes from. And he makes the point that having used this obscure part of the Espionage Act that says that, hell, if somebody just shoved something through your mail slot and landed on your porch or in your house, you're guilty, whether you haven't done anything else or not. And then to go ahead and publish it, what have you. If that's the law, then Taibbi says we're going to be looking hard and low for publishers and journalists who are willing to dare do what Assange did. That ties in with this notion of kind of making him being a warning. Do you agree with Matt Taibbi though on that?
Well, I mean, but the law clearly is not that. There's not been a case that has ever said that. So as I said earlier, I mean, one could argue that the Trump administration broadened the case and the indictment exists today because that they want to scare the mainstream media into believing that they will be found guilty, that they at least will have legal troubles if they do that. But I think the only thing I disagree with what Erin said about in terms of the financial stress the media is under is that despite that, I mean, that if the mainstream media that has money or has some money has done a fantastic job over the last few years. I mean, the reporting on Trump, whether it's been his, faux businesses, his tax returns, his sexcapades, the holes in his administration. There have been disclosures. There were disclosures almost every day of this administration about some malfeasance or other. And the Times and the Washington Post, I think, were the two main factors that have done that. But I wouldn't, the notion that the media is not still, enthusiastically covering the government and is, a watchdog over government, I think it still is, to the extent they have reporters they can pay to do the job. And some media, local media, which is a bigger problem than what we're talking about, doesn't have the resources and therefore isn't doing that good a job. But in terms of national security, as it's covered by the main newspapers and main TV networks, I think has done an exemplary job under incredible pressure in the last 4 years of a president whose seems like almost only goal was to beat up the media because he didn't want the public to believe all the investigative reporting that was being done about him. That was his whole strategy in saying they were the enemy of the people. Fake news was, he said that once in an interview, that I do that because I don't want them to believe the stuff about me that they're putting out. And despite that, I think, the mainstream media did a terrific job over the last 4 years. So I think.
All right. I just, because I want to move along, I agree with you about Trump. I'm not sure when it comes to what they did with respect to foreign policy and classified documents with respect to their foreign policy. But I want to put the question to you from Robert Corsini. He said, would somebody please speak to the double standard of the outrage that Jamal Khashoggi's murder and the slow motion murder of Assange, the double standard. One generated outrage by the press, and as far as Assange is concerned, he's been somewhat forgotten, and yet he's been suffering so long. He's not been killed yet, but it's a miracle he hasn't been, frankly, in the jail conditions he's been in. It's been reported by the rapporteur in charge of this at the UN that his mental state and what has happened to him as a result of this persecution by the US government for all this period of time, and by England and some other foreign powers as well, has left him in a state where he's damn near suicidal because of the mental torment and couldn't possibly be put in one of these rotten American prisons. Is that not some evidence of a double standard? Robert wants to know.
Yeah, but I would say that's an easy one. Jamal Khashoggi was brutally murdered, dismembered. I mean, something that you could not help be shocked by, and it was such so clearly retaliation and so dastardly that it caught people's imagination. I think the kind of long, slow oppression of Assange is very different for that reason. It's not good optics, right? Or bad optics.
It's not good optics, but I mean, but nevertheless, in many ways, it has more to do with freedom of the press in
I
America.
agree. Oh yeah, for sure. I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying, knowing how people react to stories. And I think, I really think the public.
You're saying because Khashoggi bled, as opposed to if it bleeds,
it led. Correct.
Yeah, not exactly the highest standard of journalism I can think of.
No, and also it involved bad actors with the Saudi government. I mean, there's a lot of intrigue like that that people could get behind and oppose. Julian Assange presents a much more complicated problem. He's not a columnist, speaking his mind. He's someone who's putting out, turning all the lights on. Some of the information is very, absolutely essential. We wouldn't have known before. Some of it, people don't know what to make of it. They don't quite know what to make of Julian Assange.
Arguably Assange is arguably more dangerous to freedom of the press in America and in the long run. George, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with Erin. I mean, the dismembering of, I think suggesting it's a double standard. I can't really agree with that. I mean, the guy was dismembered and murdered brutally. That's a different thing than being a criminal defendant in a case that goes through a court system, at least so far in England, that is, there's due process or what have you. And in fact, the judge decided that the U.S. jails were too dastardly, therefore kept them from coming here for that very reason. So I think there are two different cases, and I wouldn't make the comparison.
All right. Okay. Well, we're almost out of time. Let's take another question or two, though, that's lined up here. To what extent do you think that, to the extent there's been some, initially, I should say this, initially when Assange was indicted, the major press made comments about it. They always managed to throw in something about his supposed personality quirks, but they said that they opposed it and they saw it as a threat to certainly to freedom of the press in America. But there hasn't been as much about it. There's been reporting on it, on the extradition case and on so forth. But again, I've followed this rather closely, as has our National Defense Committee. And there really hasn't been a lot of impassioned mainstream press coming to Assange's defense along the road here. There's been many turning points in that road, including right now. I mean, maybe I missed it, but I haven't seen a lot of editorials condemning the Biden administration for continuing to appeal the extradition ruling in his favor. So what do we make of that, Erin or George?
I think that's a fair point. As I said, I think so far it's too early. I mean, this wasn't obviously at the top of Biden's agenda. I think I'm hopeful that they'll do the right thing over time. But it's just a tough position, I think, to leap into. I don't know. I think that the press, wherever the press deals with itself, it doesn't do itself any favors. The press is one of the worst spokesmen for itself, and it has been for time immemorial. I mean, there were times when we were trying to get freedom of information documents from the government, and we should have gotten it. And whether it was Rudy Giuliani when he was mayor of New York or President Bush, we wouldn't get the documents. And I said, why don't we do an editorial and beat the shit out of these people, and then we'll make some headway. Right. Oh no, we don't want to get involved. We don't want to be lobbyists for ourselves. we really don't do PR for ourselves. And I'm not sure that that's the full answer, Jim, to what you're raising, but we don't have a history of helping ourselves from a
No, it's a
public
good point.
relations point of view.
Yeah, no, it's a good and sad point, which leaves it, of course, to us, the Assange Defense Committee, and all of you who have joined us tonight in this webinar, I hope. And I'm proud to say and pleased to say that, you know, dozens of groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and the ACLU and all sorts of media outlets have taken positions on this and are actively beseeching the government to stop the persecution and prosecution of Julian Assange. Erin, and before we stop, let me ask each of you if I have a last thought or two you'd like to express.
Oh, I was just going to add in response to the last question, or your question. Yeah, I think the press, much of it hasn't made up its mind about Assange. I think George is right. The press doesn't represent itself well, its own issues well. But I think that there's not a consensus about Assange and the whole
oh dear, we're having a breakup
problem, the whole WikiLeaks phenomenon. It's okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
Did I freeze?
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, just to say, I really think the mainstream press here there's not really consensus about whether it agrees with Assange, or whether it agrees with WikiLeaks, whether it's anti-government or you know, pro public's right to know. I mean, it's you know, it's a mix, and so I think the press is sort of as confused as most Americans about it.
Yes, and about online publications and publishing in general. George, last thought for you before we have to wrap this up.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's the facts are complicated. He hasn't gotten the support that maybe you would think that he would have gotten. I agree with that. Why that is hard to say, whether it's because he maybe didn't seem to give the appearance of editing or of being as responsible about the material he had. What was his real purpose? I mean, those are the questions that I think have mixed answers out there, and that's the reason. But I mean, to me, the most important thing is that, you know, good law, or at least not bad law, is made as a result of all this, and the best solution, short of a victory, and he might well win a case. I mean, juries have a way of doing the right thing, even if they get instructions for a judge that aren't 100% supportive. But I don't think it's going to come to that. I think, just like, don't forget, I mean, we criticized, or Ellsberg criticized the Obama administration, but they didn't bring this indictment, despite the fact that the grand jury worked for 3 years and he was in office for 6 years while this was going on. He was afraid of the New York Times problem, as you put it aptly in your title. And I think Biden is in the same position, albeit the case has moved on. But I think in the end, he's going to bow to his own instincts about the press doing their job and being respectful. And to me, that would be the most important and the best solution.
Well, I would like to share your optimism. I sure as hell hope you were right about that. I really do. No, I really do. And you may well be, and we certainly hope so. But I, for one, am not going to rest on that hope. And I know you're not either. And that's why all of us have gathered today. I thank both George Freeman and Erin Aubry Kaplan, and all of you who've signed into the website. We got to some of your questions. I know we didn't get to all of them. Before we do say goodnight, though, because I do believe that if we want to be assured of George's optimism coming to pass, or his hope coming to pass, we're going to have to work hard for that, I believe. That means that go on to the defendassange.org website. There it is, AssangeDefense.org. You'll learn all about the global, around the world, the protests and actions that are going to take place Sunday, April the 11th on behalf of Assange. Write to Biden's, write, you know, it's easy to do. You go online, you do that. You write to Merrick, you write to the Justice Department. Drop your appeal. You said, you know, remember what Obama did, you know, drop your appeal. Don't continue to prosecute Julian Assange. I subscribe to the school that it's only if enough of us, and more people are doing it, more and more of the leading free press and civil liberties groups in the country have come to his defense and in the world have come to his defense. And it's only if we continue to be strong and fight for what Assange says, the truth, which is all that really matters, can we defend Assange and in the long run defend our own democracy, freedom of the press, and other reporters who would want to do what he did if they believe they can do it without facing what Assange has had to face. So thank you for joining us now. Stay active with this cause. Keep checking that website and help in any way you can to raise the torch for Julian Assange. Thank you, my friends.
All right, thank you, everybody. Gonna have to close it out here. Thanks.